to do, I don't do no more. The things I used to do, I don't do no more. Things I used to do, I don't do no more. For the Lord's made a change in me.
This is Melissa, and today is the 15th of May, 2025, and I hope that you are all doing well. And I just wanted to give you kind of a last-minute real history. I didn't have anything scheduled or planned, and it's already 8 o'clock on Thursday evening, but I thought a little update, and that is I'm returning my schedule to a more normal kind of schedule for myself, and I did need to take the last few days to sort of, they say pick up steam. How do you pick up steam? You add coal, add fuel, but I've been doing that. I've been just taking care of myself, and I have been at this project with my Aunt Betty since late January, and it's just about where I hoped it would be, maybe a week more to, what they call staging the house for the realtors, if she ever gets there. But what became clear to me once my cousin arrived and we had different voices and perspective is I think that there was an element of Betty just liking my company, and I was there nearly every day for months, and so I'm having to wean her off of that. And she had set out to do this, to go into assisted living, which would be a good idea. She's getting wobbly, and I saw her fall a month ago, and I've seen her almost fall just last week, and it's tough. It's a tough thing, but she's doing all right. I got her some fig preserves for Mother's Day and some ginger snap cookies. Those are her favorite things. And I sent my Aunt Mary down in South Texas some orange yarn. And she likes to do crochet, and she called me and said it was beautiful and she loved it, and she's going to start crocheting a scarf. She said, I just ran out of yarn and I was wondering what I was going to do for my next project, and now I have it. And orange is my favorite color, and I knew that, so that is fun. She had been talking to Betty and said, I want her to come down and help me organize my things. So I think that Mary is going to be 98 in September, which is amazing. And every time I talk to her, she has a project on the go, something that she's working on. She really is amazing. But she too had a big fall just about a year ago, and they wanted to do skin grafts on her. It was that bad, but she just didn't want to do that, and went through having her bandages changed pretty much every day or every other day at the minimum. So that's the update on the aunts. I'm returning to a normal schedule, and I feel good about that. So I'm catching up with everything, and that includes emails, and it also includes returning to doing real histories on hopefully a weekly basis, and not doing crazy things like just blowing Neil Foster off, forgetting to call him and say, I'm too busy. After all, he stepped in a couple of times, or 3 times maybe, but he did step in and help me by just supplying the talks without me. So we'll be hearing from him next month, and that is a good thing. So in returning to the schedule, I checked in with Nick of Hayes Reviews. First of all, we were talking about he's going to cover some of Waiting for the Miracle. And I was discussing the schedule and what would work for him, and etc. And then we ended up talking again yesterday. So it was 2 days ago we talked about that. We had a good long conversation yesterday. And I said, we said that we had a novel that we were going to cover, and I kept it secret from everybody. I said the next book is a surprise, and I never got around to announcing what it was, and because we had decided that we were going to record something next week and just put it up there covering this novel. And I said, well, I haven't read it yet. He said, well, it's 400 pages, but it's a quick read, and if you've seen the movie The Matrix, you'll be able to get into a kind of a similar setting for the story and so forth. So we agreed, yeah, we're going to record next week. And then when we were talking again yesterday, I said, Nick, there were people, including Neil Foster, who actually read We along with us, and I got some feedback from different people who were reading, and so I think we have to give people an opportunity to read this novel if they want to. And so he said, yes, absolutely. And I said, so that pushes us out at least probably 3 weeks from now into early to mid-June. And the novel is Snow Crash. It's a 1992 science fiction novel by Neal Stephenson, an American writer. And you can find this on different online sources. I saw used copies at different places starting at like under $5. And it might be something that is at your local library. And they didn't make a movie out of it, so you can't see it that way. I didn't take the time to check and see if if somebody online read it and made an audiobook of it. But if you're interested in reading along, you now have 3 weeks. And I told Nick I hadn't, like I said, I hadn't started reading it. And so if I haven't started reading it, there's time for you to start reading it. So there you go. Deciding that I needed to tell you to get the book if you wanted to, or check it out from the library and do this with us. I just prompted me to look into a couple of things about the book and about Neal Stephenson and so forth. And most of my sources here, I think I'm going to read a little bit from a New York Times article, but most everything else is coming to you straight out of good old Wikipedia. It says that, like many of Stevenson's novels, its themes include history, linguistics, anthropology, archaeology, religion, computer science, politics, cryptography, memetics, and philosophy. And memetics, of course, is where we get the word meme. Reading on in Wiki, it says, in his 1999 essay, In the Beginning Was the Command Line, Stevenson explained the title of the novel as his term for a particular software failure mode on the early Macintosh computer. Stevenson wrote, when the computer crashed and wrote gibberish into the bitmap, the result was something that looked vaguely like static on a broken television set, a snow crash. Stevenson also has mentioned that Julian Jaynes' book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, was one of the main influences on Snow Crash. It goes on to tell you what awards it won, and then it gives you a little plot summary if you're interested. So immediately I had some things to look at. I wanted to know, who is Neal Stephenson? I've heard of him. I know that I've heard he's the darling of the Silicon Valley crowd, and he's one of those they deem an important science fiction writer. So I wanted to look into him, and I was also curious about the 1999 essay, In the Beginning Was the Command Line. John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But in this essay, In the Beginning Was the Command Line. And those of you who had anything to do with DOS, and I'm old enough to have used that system, there's the command line. You give it your command, and it does whatever you command it to do. So I'll start there. This was an essay that he wrote, and it's a commentary on why the proprietary operating systems business is unlikely to remain profitable in the future because of competition from free software. It also analyzes the corporate collective culture of the Microsoft, Apple computer, and free software communities. Now, this is kind of interesting because that was written 26 years ago, and it's clear that I don't know how profitable these operating systems are, that these proprietary operating systems are, but I do know now that what used to be free on Windows years ago, you all had Word or whatever, now you have to rent it every year. So that is obviously how they are, part of the business model for making money. And then I went to one of the other things that he said inspired him, which was The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, a 1976 book by the Princeton psychologist, psychohistorian, and consciousness theorist Julian Jaynes, who lived from 1920 to 1997. It explores the nature of consciousness, particularly the ability to introspect, and its evolution in ancient human history. Jaynes proposes that consciousness is a learned behavior, rooted in language and culture, rather than being innate. He distinguishes consciousness from sensory awareness and cognition. Jaynes introduces the concept of the bicameral mind, a non-conscious mentality prevalent in early humans that relied on auditory hallucinations. Now, it's an interesting theory. I read the entirety of this wiki, and then I did some more reading on Jaynes and his theory of the concept of the bicameral mind. And it's basically that you've got the part of the mind. It's not exactly the left and the right hemispheres talking to each other, but you've got the part of the mind that gives the command. This is where the auditory hallucination comes in. And then the part of the mind that receives and acts upon the command. And in Jaynes' concept of the bicameral mind, he posits that even people as recently as the ancient Egyptians had this kind of mind. They did not have the idea of themselves as individuated in the way that we think of ourselves as individuated and able to be conscious of ourselves as individuals. So it's interesting, and I think just all this little reading overview that I did got me thinking about several different things. I am not exactly sure how these ideas will tie into Snow Crash because I haven't started reading the novel yet. But critics, favorable and unfavorable to Stephenson and the novel, talk about his ideas about language, and that he views language as not something that is organic and springs up around, say, geographical region and tribe and that kind of way that we think of language, but that it is code that programs us. And this is a long topic, and I won't go too far down this tonight, but Alan was always encouraging us to be human, to be creative, to tap into what was human in us and what makes us individuals, that it was the individual who poses a problem for the system. The individual has a degree of control over their own mind, and therefore their own, what comes into their mind, you might say, programs one. And I don't like using too many computer kind of analogies, and it's funny because I've heard Nick Hayes say the same thing. So we want to remember that we are humans. We're not the hackable computers that people like Yuval Noah Harari say that we are. Humans are hackable. The goal is consciousness, that is truth. And once we, Alan would say, the only material that you have to work with is your own mind. And so are we programmable? Yes, we are. But when we are conscious, the goal is not to be programmable. That is possible. But it does take a lot of effort. It can be the work of a lifetime. But it is interesting because I think in Stevenson's idea that that language is coding, I think that there would actually be some agreement with Alan, because Alan talked a lot about how language programs us. And his Cutting Through volumes really are about that, playing with words, breaking down words, and showing us different meanings and the way words are strung together. Now, what's interesting in Snow Crash is that we have the portmanteau, that's a new word made of other words. We have the portmanteau metaverse, which comes out of Snow Crash. And we've heard a lot about the metaverse and augmented reality and virtual reality now, but it was first seen in the novel Snow Crash from 1992. So that's meta, like the big picture, the overarching thing. And verse comes from universe. And I think that the word avatar was first seen in another novel, I believe in the late 80s, but it was popularized. It really came into popularity because of the way that Neal Stephenson used that in Snow Crash. And in fact, he used avatar exactly the way we now use avatar, both in the digital and in real life world. I'll just take a little bit of a trip over to an article that I found from 2022 about Neal Stephenson from the New York Times. And I will post this. This is about the future that we are going into and what possibly would prompt us to change our behavior. Now, this is very important because novelists play an important part in our behavior modification. So the title of this article is Neal Stephenson Thinks Greed Might Be the Thing That Saves Us. And it introduces him and the kind of grim dystopian futures that he writes about. And the writer of the article asks a question, makes a statement, and then asks a question. We're facing a potentially apocalyptic event in climate change. So it makes sense that post-apocalyptic dystopia is where people's heads are at as far as sci-fi and speculative fiction. But we're also surrounded by incredible technologies that make our lives better, and we're going to need new technologies to help combat climate change. So why don't we see much creative output that points toward the future in more hopeful or aspirational ways? And so this is where Neal Stephenson talks about it as possibly just an economic calculation that gets people to see that greed is good, that it's in their financial self-interest to do what he is positing is the right thing, which is to participate in saving the environment. The author of this article then asks, what about this story we are telling as a society beyond art about climate change? Is there a way we could be talking about it that's more likely to motivate the kind of mobilization we had, say, during the Second World War? Now, for longtime listeners to Alan Watt, that second question should spark you to remember how many times Alan talked. He usually didn't mention her by name, but he would say, that British MP from the Green Party who said we need something like they had in World War II around climate change that would prompt people to change their behavior, like rationing and all of the good things that save the environment. That is what we need. Now, I've subsequently linked to her so many times, and this was in 2011 when we got that famous quote from her, that I can actually remember her name now. and it's Caroline Lucas. Now, I don't know if I'll be able to remember it tomorrow, but right now I could remember Caroline Lucas said, we need that World War II scenario to get people to change their behavior. So this is what Neal Stephenson said in response to this question, or those two questions. He said, the difficulty is that it's hard to get lots of people to change their minds. The United States did mobilize in a massive way during World War II, but we didn't start getting serious about it until 1942. There had been a huge war raging since 1939, and the Brits were tearing their hair out, waiting for the United States to get more involved, and it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that there was a tipping point in public opinion that made it possible for America's political leadership to declare war and to enter into it in a serious way. Now, just let me read the second part of that sentence again so that you can let it sink in. And it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that there was a tipping point in public opinion that made it possible for America's political leadership to declare war and to enter into it in a serious way. So they needed that, what we now call the Pearl Harbor event. They needed Pearl Harbor to tip public opinion. So what Neal Stephenson is saying, and what he'll well know, because we learn if we study his biography that he's got an uncle who is a well-known historian, and he also comes from a science background, which is interesting. That's what he's saying. There was public opinion had to be swayed. So then Neal Stephenson says, so the question asks itself, what might be a climate equivalent of Pearl Harbor? We're already having little regional Pearl Harbors all over the place. We had our heat dome in Seattle over the summer. We had the mega tornado supercell that passed from Arkansas to Kentucky. These little pinprick Pearl Harbor events happen here and there, but it's difficult to imagine one that would impact an entire country the size of the United States. If it did, it would be a really bad thing. Now, this article, remember, was written in January of 2022, and we've had a lot of these little pinprick Pearl Harbor events, flooding in the Carolinas and in Tennessee, and in tornadoes and hurricanes, massive events in Florida, and those fires in Hawaii. And we don't need to talk about how any of this started or was exacerbated or magnified. It just, they happened. So he goes on to talk at great length about climate change. And as far as I know, this is coming out, this interview is coming out with him because the latest novel that he wrote was published late 2021, I think, called Termination Shock. And termination shock, there is some climate cataclysm that is about to happen. So the interviewer says, in Termination Shock, you have a billionaire character who tries to attack that problem through geoengineering. You've talked elsewhere about writing about geoengineering as a way of ensuring that people are more prepared for it when it starts to happen. Is that something you see as a primary function of fiction, introducing concepts or ideas to the public? Of course, Stephenson denies that. He said, job number one is to be entertaining, or people aren't going to read the book. Then he says if you've gotten over that hurdle, it becomes possible to start thinking about other things. And he is not writing something, he says, with the mindset of I'm going to change people's minds or push a particular point of view that the audience recognizes that on a pre-verbal level, and then they lose their suspension of disbelief. But the question was asked, and he doesn't deny it. He doesn't say, the interviewer says, are you writing about this as a way of ensuring that people are more prepared for it when it starts to happen? And he then goes on to describe something that he had been reading lately. And this was a piece by an American philosopher named Charles Sanders Peirce. And this was written in 1877, and it was entitled The Fixation of Belief. And so Neal Stephenson said that Sanders Peirce goes through a list of 4 methods that people use to decide what they're going to believe. The first one is called the method of tenacity, which means you decide what you're going to believe and you stick with it, regardless of logic or evidence. The next method is called the method of authority, where you agree with other people that you're all going to believe what some authority figure tells you to believe. That's probably most common throughout history. The third method is called the a priori method, and the idea is, let's be reasonable and try to come up with ways to believe things that sound reasonable to us. And this sounds great, but it's not grounded in any fact-checking methodology, and so you just end up agreeing to believe things by consensus. And consensus may be totally wrong. The fourth method is the scientific method. It basically consists of accepting the fact that you might be wrong. And since you might be wrong, you need some way for judging the truth of statements and changing your mind when you've got solid evidence to the contrary. One interesting thing about snow crash, I learned when I'm reading about it, that it brings in Sumer. And we have been covering Sumer, this ancient Sumerian civilization, in the book club, because Alan talks about Sumer as what he saw there in his research. What one sees is a system, an ancient system of control that arrives in Sumer completely worked out. So, and Alan's not going for the ancient astronauts kind of explanation for this. In other words, all of our technology was brought to us by aliens. So Alan's not buying that because he knows who put that out. But there is a character in the novel who, the billionaire, and they're doing some research, and the research showed that the ancient Sumerian language allowed, or the proto-human language, allowed brain function to be programmed using audio stimuli in conjunction with a DNA-altering virus. So snow crash is a virus. It's a computer virus, and it's also a, in the real world, body virus. So this is something from the novel. It's the Sumerian language allowed brain function to be programmed using audio stimuli in conjunction with a DNA-altering virus. Sumerian culture was organized around these programs known as me. So Sumerian culture was organized around these programs known as me. That's where you get the meme, me, which priests administered to the populace. So interesting, because the computer virus, the physical form of it, was a kind of an addictive drug. And I think we certainly have evidence that lots of people are addicted to the delivery system anyway, meaning the computer. I wanted to mention briefly here, without going too far astray, that when I saw that Neal Stephenson had been influenced by this concept and its auditory hallucinations, particularly those hallucinations known as command hallucinations, this reminded me of the work of Jerry Marzinski. I've only seen maybe 3 of his video interviews. He's a psychologist who's coming out of the prison world and also mental institutions. And he posits something about the hallucinations that is very interesting. He said hallucinations don't have a pattern where they repeat the same thing, or you know what's going to come next based on a pattern. He said hallucinations are all over the place, all over the world, and they are, one could have a hallucination that could take them anywhere, and it's not necessarily a negative thing or what you might call a bad trip. It's a hallucination, seeing something or hearing something that's not there. And he said, but when you get into dealing with schizophrenics, and this is one thing that Alan said a few times, is they can't really tell you what causes something. They just say, here's the drug. And Jerry Marzinski was in this world asking questions and not satisfied with what was being offered. And he talked to people who were having these so-called auditory hallucinations, which often would be command hallucinations, in other words, telling them to do something. And what he got was the consistent response that these hallucinations, these voices, were always negative. They were always accusing, or mostly accusing. You're not good enough. Why did you? You should have. And he said there's no hallucination that he's aware of where it repeats that same kind of pattern. And I think this is a topic that I could really dive into, because Alan had also interesting things to say about what is it that you're actually seeing when you're looking at certain kinds of defined illnesses, even something like psychopathy. But Alan has raised this with me. So it is interesting. The whole idea of voices, when someone says, I heard something, whether it's, the devil or God, or, someone told me to do something, I got this, what is it that is actually being heard? And in that book that was written in the 70s by Jaynes, he actually made a very interesting comment, and he may have gone into it in great detail in the book, I don't know, but he made an interesting comment about the so-called evolution of the mind or consciousness. So Jaynes places the origin, literally the origin of consciousness, around the 2nd millennium BCE, and suggests that the transition from the bicameral mind to consciousness was triggered by the breakdown of the bicameral system. The bicameral mind, he explains, was characterized by individuals experiencing auditory hallucinations as commands from gods guiding their actions. Now, this is one man's theory, but it's very interesting because at one thing that I read, he is saying that as civilization became more complex and civilizations became more populated, more, the areas were populated by more people and groups of people, it became necessary as a form of control to have a different way of interacting with the populace. So I haven't read the book, but it leads me to think that he is positing that the idea that these auditory hallucinations or commands that people thought were commands from their gods guiding their actions became too cumbersome as a way of controlling people. So we're left to think that he's possibly saying that this bicameral mind itself was a created control mechanism. And he says here, and I'm expecting to get some of this from Stephenson's book, that consciousness is a learned behavior rooted in language. And it reminded me in the very first interview of Waiting for the Miracle book that we're covering, in order to distinguish them from just being interview 1, 2, and 3, Andrea suggested I title them, and I entitled the first one, Consciousness is Knowing the Truth. And I would have to say that I disagree with any concept or theory that talks about consciousness as a learned behavior, because I think that the quest for truth, and that is the most important part of that quest, is the internal journey, I believe is wired into humans, or at least some humans. So we don't have to be taught to seek truth. And we don't have to be taught truth. I had intended to post this last night, and I finished it and rendered the video, and I was getting tired, but I was going to upload it. But there was something nagging at me besides just being tired, that there was something else that I wanted to look into before I shared it with you, something missing, but I just gave up and went to bed. And when I woke up this morning, I stalled on completing it or going back to it or uploading, because I still hadn't answered the question or found the missing puzzle piece. And I'm not sure if I had, but the break allowed me to wash my sheets and vacuum the house, so it's all good. But while I was doing that, I thought, I don't have time to read Jaynes' book, Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, or in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, but I went searching, and I did find a shorter essay that he wrote, and I read quite a bit of this. And so now I just want to share a little bit of this with you, and I'm going to plug it into what I made yesterday and then share it with you. And this was an afterword that Jaynes wrote. So this would have been in the 80s, because he said, "It is now more than a decade since this essay first appeared in book form, and my publishers have encouraged me to add a postscript in which I might discuss the general reaction to this book, as well as changes I might make if I were to rewrite it. A favorite practice of some professional intellectuals, when at first faced with a theory as large as the one I have presented, is to search for that loose thread which, when pulled, will unravel all the rest, and rightly so. It is part of the discipline of scientific thinking. In any work covering so much of the terrain of human nature and history, hustling into territories jealously guarded by myriad aggressive specialists, there are bound to be such errancies, sometimes of fact, but I fear more often of tone. But that the knitting of this book is such that a tug on such a bad stitch will unravel all the rest is more of a hope on the part of the orthodox than a fact in the scientific pursuit of truth. The book is not a single hypothesis." And then he goes on to outline a few things, and I'm going to link to this afterward for any of you who happen to be interested. I don't expect that you will all be interested in whatever flights of fancy my mind takes me on, but I'm sharing it nonetheless. He talks about consciousness, his first premise that he repeats. He's repeating the 4 main hypotheses in books 1 and 2, and then he adds comments to them. And the very first one is that consciousness is based on language. And I will let you read this if you're interested. He said the most common error is that consciousness is confused with perception. He was delivering a speech at a meeting, and a prestigious philosopher stood up and objected and said, I am perceiving you at this moment. Are you trying to say that I'm not conscious of you at this moment? So the association of perception with consciousness. And Jaynes continues to write, this type of confusion was at least encouraged back in 1921 by Bertrand Russell, who said, we are conscious of anything that we perceive. And as his logical atomism became fashionable in philosophy, it became difficult to see it any other way. And in a later book, Russell uses, as an example of consciousness, I see a table. But Descartes, who gave us the modern idea of consciousness, would never have agreed. Nor would a radical behaviorist like Watson, who in denying consciousness existed, certainly did not mean sense perception. So there is a lot in this longish essay of about 60 odd pages that I think is very interesting. I will disagree right off the bat that consciousness is based on language. I will return to what Alan suggested when he was speaking with Jackie in the Waiting for the Miracle interview, that consciousness, he had come to see, is truth. And he said truth can be hard to find, and he talks about things buried in archives and so forth, but truth is something that is above and beyond language, because language is simply, as whether it's pictographs or writing as we now know it, some alphabet or the spoken language, there are ways to communicate truth that are beyond language. But what was really interesting to me, what was most thought-provoking, was he repeats here in this afterword the idea that the bicameral mind was used as a form of control in ancient days, before man became conscious, so to speak. And he combines 2 concepts, the evolution of the human mind and the evolution of consciousness, but he also has the idea that there's an element of control. So when I look at that, and again, I haven't studied it too deeply, I just dived into this yesterday, but when I think about that, I consider that, is it human evolution, or is it an evolution of consciousness if there is a controller, if there's some controlling mechanism behind it? And so I got to the part in the essay that I thought was quite interesting. I think this is the 6th section of the 6th. I'm not sure if this is the part of the book, because I don't have the book, or if it's part of the afterword, but it is the origin of civilization. And he writes, but wherefore should there be such a thing as the bicameral mind? And why are there gods? What can be the origin of things divine? And if the organization of the brain in bicameral times was, as I have suggested in the previous chapter, what could the selective pressures in human evolution have been to bring about so mighty a result? The speculative thesis, which I shall try to explain in this chapter, and it is very speculative, is simply an obvious corollary from what has gone before. The bicameral mind is a form of social control. And it is that form of social control which allowed mankind to move from small hunter-gatherer groups to large agricultural communities. The bicameral mind, with its controlling gods, was evolved as a final stage of the evolution of language. And in this development lies the origin of civilization. And then he continues, let us begin by looking at what we mean by social control. Now, there are social scientists who are into the whole world of group evolution. So, I'm not saying that if you have control, it negates the idea that you're evolving, but we all know that the theory of evolution has a lot of holes that can be punched into it, and I think that Alan successfully punched those holes over the years, and I think that applies to the social sciences group evolution thinking. So I will let you listen now to what Alan is saying. I'm about to share a quote with you, and then put that up against what Marzinski is saying, and then return to Jaynes and the idea of that my speculation, very speculative, is speculation based on years of listening and talking with Alan, and that there is something else. It's that something else that a lot of people do not want to consider, and that's fine. But I do consider it. In book club, someone posted the other day a little bit, a quote from one of Alan Watts' talks, and this was an interview with Jackie Petru on Sweet Liberty from August 31, 2004, and I think I actually replayed this one not that long ago, both the date and what Alan is saying. It is very familiar, as in very recent. Alan said, "You can achieve spiritual awareness, you might say, by yourself. If your soul is seeking it, you will achieve it. Or you can try and take the shortcut of the world, which is to join a Freemasonic society in one of its many thousands of names, and try and get it by degrees, which is basically taking entities into you with each degree that you take. These entities, since they are the ones who are cast here in the first place, they are imprisoned here, so their prison is the world. Therefore, they have a certain amount of power within the world, not total power, but they can't go beyond the world. That's what I would like to say. They are imprisoned. They cannot go beyond the world. That's why their boast is always to conquer space and rise higher than the Creator, because this world and its atmosphere is their prison." That is a thought-provoking quote from Alan. But what grabbed me was that someone in the chat room made a brilliant comment. They said, for the first time, it has clicked. We have been born into a world ruled and managed by convicts. And I thought that that was quite a perceptive way of seeing it. That is true. For the first time, it has clicked. We've been born into a world ruled and managed by convicts. So we don't have to be taught to seek truth. And we don't have to be taught truth. As Alan said in that quote that I shared, you can achieve spiritual awareness, you might say, by yourself. If your soul is seeking it, you will achieve it. So again, we've got people who build rocket ships trying to go to Mars, and we have the writers that they admire, and they all repeat the same thing over and over in a kind of their own auditory hallucination that they generate for us, which is, we are nothing, and if we are anything, it's people who are destroying the environment, and we must be controlled, and we must be made to be better. Neal Stephenson is the darling of Silicon Valley crew, and when you looked at the people who were surrounding Donald Trump at his inauguration, among the ones right there in the group around him were Mark Zuckerberg of what was known as Facebook, which is now Meta, which comes from the metaverse. And we had, of course, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos, besides Amazon, has a company called Blue Origin, which has been working on rocketry, rocket manufacture, and for years. I don't know when the company started. But he just had a publicity stunt not a month ago, I don't think, where a group of women, including his fiance and other women, doesn't matter who they were, Oprah Winfrey's sidekick, but they all went on a little trip in a rocket. So that's Blue Origin. And we learn that Neal Stephenson is, of course, a futurist. It would be interesting to me to really know his background. His father was an engineer and taught engineering, and his grandfather, I think, taught maybe physics, and his mother worked at a biochemistry lab, and her father taught biochemistry. And Neal Stephenson was going to study physics, but he switched his major when he realized that he'd have more time to spend on the university's mainframe. So big computers back before we had personal computers, if he switched his major over to geography, I think. It is said that some of his writing influenced the people who created Google Earth. And he has been a consultant, a paid consultant for Bezos' Blue Origin rocket company for a number of years. I don't know if he's still doing that or not. So this novelist, there's definitely more than meets the eye about who he is and what he's involved with. But as I've been doing catch-up this week and trying to connect with people and make plans as to what comes next and scheduling and so forth, I spoke briefly with Neil Foster, and he had told me about a book that I had never heard of before, and it was published in 2006, but it was the English translation of an unpublished German language science fiction novel that was written by the rocket scientist, the rocket physicist, Wernher von Braun. In 1949, he wrote it, and the English title of it is Project Mars, A Technical Tale. And you can look this up on Wiki or elsewhere. So it's describing the first human mission to Mars and its encounter with benevolent Martians. And it goes on to describe what a brief little synopsis of it. And so they send these explorers to Mars. The explorers soon make contact with Martians who are humanoid in appearance and live underground. They welcome the Earthlings, who quickly establish that Martians have an ancient and benevolent super civilization. After establishing verbal communication, the humans learn about the Martians' social structure and government, which is run by 10 males under the leadership of the Elon. The Elon is the leadership. Interesting. And the visitors witness technology far superior to their own, including underground transport and organ transplants. So they learn from the Martian their views on ethics and morality and the responsible use of technology. So very interesting, and I don't think at all coincidental. It's just kind of interesting, the convicts that run us. And I do agree with Alan. I see this as exactly what is going on. Nothing is what it seems. We're given some political rubbish that we're supposed to get involved with, and yet we just march down through time to an agenda that's very different from any of the things that we're supposed to be paying attention to. But the little coterie, the little cabal around Trump at his inauguration was quite telling to me, and just interesting to see it all tied together in the concepts that we're going to discover when we read Snow Crash. I think that is about it on this for now. I don't have the new date in front of me. Let me take a peek. It's the 15th. I haven't put it to Nick now with the new time, but we'll either be covering this the 1st or the 3rd week of June, depending on what works for Nick. The 2nd week of June, hopefully it'll all work for Neil Foster and I to be speaking. So either the 1st or the 3rd week of June we'll cover this. So like I said, plenty of time for you to go and get Snow Crash and read along with us if you like. Also, I want to let you know that next week I am going to be speaking with someone who comes out of the Silicon Valley world. I have mentioned him before, and I've posted to a PowerPoint presentation that he did, which is on YouTube and other channels, entitled The 5 Pillars to Enslave Humanity. And this is Digital ID or Digital Prison and the 5 Pillars to Enslave Humanity, a presentation by Aman Jabbi. And I've spoken with him a couple of 3 times, I don't remember now. But he worked in Silicon Valley for a number of years in camera and optics. So he said if you're using a cell phone and it has a camera built into it, that camera technology, he probably had something to do with it. And he's been involved in a few different startup companies. What I'm saying is he knows what he's talking about when he is talking about how all of this digital transformation plays into how we're supposed to respond to climate change, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and so forth. So I think it will be an interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. And I may link to that again, that presentation, and what I told him. He does such a clear and concise job of laying out what's involved, the mechanisms of control, how much of it is already being used today, and where we are in the progression or process of having much of this implemented in our lives. I thought I might just intersperse bits of the presentation, just kind of cut it into the conversation that we record. I don't know yet. We'll speak again tomorrow and kind of see how this might unfold. But that will be next Thursday's Real History. And I'm also going to be scheduling something I mentioned with Jonathan Cooey from Gigome Biological. And I'm looking forward to that. And I noticed I had reposted his interview with Paula Aitken, who is mom number 4. I really want to get Jonathan to put me in contact with her and have a conversation with her, because I thought that what she is talking about and what happened to her son, and the more than 30 years that she has spent studying these interventions and so forth, and the effects that it had on her son and how it changed her life. And she's just a really amazing mother, as many mothers are who have to face this and try to find answers. So I am glad to be returning to my more normal schedule, and I wish you all well. Have a good week, and I'll be back with something Sunday in the Redux department. And just one last thing to mention is we'll be meeting over in Telegram to discuss Waiting for the Miracle. And now that I'm finally getting back on top of things, we'll publish a schedule and a sign-up sheet if you want to talk and participate in that. So thank you all, and take care.
I've got something that the world didn't give me, and the world cannot take it away. And I've got something that the world didn't give me, and the world cannot take it away. Well, it is love, sweet love, oh, sent to me from my Father up above.